Right.
Let's see. Do you see that diagram?
Yeah.
Lovely.
Okay. So this is something I did from in a notebook when I was developing the book. I can find the date. It doesn't really matter, but it's probably 5 or 6 years ago. But it's just to show it's very long lines of this counterbalancing between attraction and repulsion forces, where at the bottom is some entity that's going to combine it becomes smaller circles. A number of the ones at the bottom combine to form something larger. You get new relations, but there are somehow forces. I think I realized today I have them mislabeled. Forces of attraction, maybe bringing things together, and forces of counter attraction and dispersion. So, I'm not that happy with the words attraction and repulsion and forces, because it's a sort of a physics term. But I am happy with it at the same time. I'm not happy, and I am happy, because when you start talking about biological, maybe biological opportunities, if things merge, it's not really a force. It is a force in some sense, but it's not a force in another sense. So I just want to show I'm really in line with us considering this issue. So I'm happy to stop sharing now.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, I missed the question. Darn it.
That's right. We're just waiting for George, and George has sent round an email. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, on the 23rd of June for review, and he's in the different levels of grand emergence. He's identified attractors and repulsors with formation of those systems. So when George gets here, he can talk us through that.
We could start some some anonymous peer review of it.
George, it's terrible.
Yes, I'm a bit confused. I think I remember receiving it, but I can't find it in any final emails. So
Okay.
I don't know. Anyway, carry on. Or the other thing I wanted to do, I noticed Tyler mentioning his Meta Patterns book. I will go and get my copy and have it beside me in case things come up. I haven't read it yet, I confess.
I've got it too. It's beautiful.
Good.
Where is it?
I'm gonna have to get it, Tyler.
with reviews like that.
Yeah.
Oh.
No, George has already told me I've got to get it.
Well, Lynn, I did do all the figures myself, so thanks.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Really?
all the collages. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
I had to make them. I don't know, maybe not just typical A, B, C, D panels, but collage them, and
Yeah.
it was an era for me.
Well, didn't you have some kind of architectural degree, undergraduate degree? It really shows. It really,
Thanks.
That part of you was all over that. That's where it all came from, all that. I mean, that part of you, obviously. Yeah.
How's your book going, Lynn? While we're waiting for George.
Oh, it's been torture. But every few months I think, okay, I got it now. The research is done. I know the material. I've got big parts of it done. Basically what I'm doing is about 12 of the, I'm writing about boundaries and hierarchies and networks and in sections. And I've just changed how I've written those sections radically, because of times have changed and people's understandings have changed. And I've gotten way more personal with it. I've gotten way more, it's kind of the story of America more than anything. And it's really interesting because it's beyond politics, it's beyond religion and science, and it's just an entire worldview.
What's the name of your book?
Well, it was going to be a field guide to the system sciences now. And now I'm looking at it, and it's
History of everything.
I don't want to say system sciences, you know, I don't want to say sciences, because every single time I write about each one, I'm deep into, you know, it's philosophy and religion and politics and science. It's how human systems are structured. And my background's in more medical and psychological and, you know, people and organizations. And boy, I don't see any difference anymore. So, and we're all clearly, the culture, I mean, is clearly moving into it, clearly. I mean, it's all over the newspapers. When you read about super spreaders, you know, you're reading about how things spread in networks, not how things spread in the old way. It was kind of seen as more like a geometric progression, you know, like on a grid. Now spreading is seen as a network effect, and that means you see power laws and different things like that. So it's I mean, it's ubiquitous in the newspaper, but not, or the New York Times anyway, and people get it, but not fully understood, all put together. Do you know what I mean? Like in the way
Can I
I just
order one
said it.
from Amazon yet?
Pardon me?
Can I order one from Amazon yet?
No, not yet. I'm dying. I'm going crazy. I'm going crazy. But my agent's pretty excited. He's pretty cool about it. I just have to get there and get it done. Torture.
Is the agent waiting to approach publishers, waiting for more of it?
You guys will be approached before I'm approaching publishers, because I'll be saying, hey, will you read this and will you comment on it, and do you endorse it or not, or what do you think? When I get to that point. I mean, I thought I was to that point 6 months ago. I mean, I thought I was getting close, and boy, I'll tell you, just the changes in things. Suddenly it seemed very passé, my book. So it's been quite a journey.
I mean, I'm contracted to write a book for Columbia University Press on world future.
Oh, good.
But the thing is, I'm already a year overdue, but given what's happened in the last year.
Exactly. Exactly. You know exactly what it is, but yeah, world future, give me a break.
I don't know where to begin where I thought I was going to say things.
I know. Well, where I began, I changed. And before it was kind of, this is the da 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 da. Now I'm starting out with things like, my father bought a franchise in 1960. 1965, the franchise was purchased by a corporation. And in that year, he walked out of the store and picked me up at middle school and took me to lunch and told me, this is the end of small business in America. And it was a complete, beautiful description of hierarchies and how they form. And once you get over a certain level, how it doesn't work anymore, you know, how it's parasitic rather than in nature, you can't be parasitic and live, you know. In nature, the body supports the cells and the tissues. You don't deplete it. So it was a perfect example of what's been going on in America. And a very good example of hierarchy, where everything else was kind of like, okay, there's hierarchies, you know, there's cells and tissues and organs, and there's stars and galaxies and super galaxies, ho-hum, you know, where this was, okay,
yeah,
this is how this works and why it's not. So excuse me for talking so much.
No, it's good. I mean, it's interesting how there are limits to growth I think in every one of those grand leaps. Yeah, in every one of those layers, there are limits to growth, I think. Yeah. So you
I would even say
by adding to, yeah. But yeah, you can only add so much, and eventually it gets to the point where I don't know, it's just unstable. Yeah.
Well, you can't suck it out of the bottom to maintain your own level, because it won't happen. The entire thing has to support everything else. We're finding it now. You know, my final comment in this one little section is, so then COVID-19 hit, and everybody finds out essential workers happen to be people of color running the subways and
Yes.
cleaning the hospitals.
Yeah.
And we're going, wait a minute, they aren't the CEOs. You know, wait a minute, who are we going to pay now? You know? I mean, so it's what's been happening here. So it's very interesting to look at it that way and to say, hey, look, we have to look at human systems in terms of natural systems, because as Lynn has been saying forever, nature has 13.5 billion years of experience in experimenting with this, and we're not very good at it. So that's the direction the book's gone. And it's weird because it didn't start like that. But now I'm sounding, you know, but I'm not being liberal. I'm not being conservative. I'm describing how things work, you know.
Cool.
Then you start seeing it. I mean, I'm tripping out. You start seeing ethics, economics, politics, all about the flows of information or messages. I'm learning from George. Messages and material and energy toward the toward this organization of a system, you know, and all of those things are the same, and we've split them up, and we split us up when we look at it like that. It's very interesting. I'm just tripping out, and so it's been organizing. I've been, you know, my book's been self-organizing, and I walk with, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, I wish you luck trying to keep the politics out of it, because when we were doing the fellows, system definition study, I was just looking up for different definitions of system, and I found this really well-written article on the web about 30 or 40 years ago, describing systems and all the system dynamics we're familiar with. And then I thought, I wonder who's written this. And I think it was a Communist Party website somewhere. And that took me straight back into dialectical materialism, which is fundamentally system dynamics.
Well, that's exactly right. When I start writing, I start sounding like Marx.
Yeah.
And it's not, he was good. It's not saying that everything he said was right on. The system that came out of it didn't have anything to do with what he wrote.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely.
You know, I mean, what he said about capitalism is absolutely right. It doesn't mean that what we called communism and what we call capitalism are good. Either one of them aren't right. You know, they're both poor design. And what we need is the capacity to design better. And some, like Copenhagen, like Denmark does a little better at it than we do so far. Norway does a little better at it than we do. Japan's working on it. You know, there's an ethic there that we're not. And ethics are fundamental. You can design ethics as no longer separate or philosophical, but actual flows of stuff toward surrounding systems that make your system healthier, period. If you don't do that, you're going to be sick. You're going to be walking over homeless people in your cities and sequestering trillions with rich people. And that's a sick system, period.
There's a plot underway. I just sent a note off to Jennifer to a proposal to introduce a new SIG. And it's basically, what is it, the future of human society or something like that.
Oh, yay.
And Gary and I and several others have been talking for quite a long time. Actually, if you read the report that's going to be circulated, I don't know, when are you going to circulate that to the membership, Gary?
Oh, I don't know, soon.
Soon, okay. But anyway, that report contains a description of what we've kind of been talking about.
Yeah. In fact,
And
I'm going to
webinar
share
that I
it with
gave-
you now.
What's that?
In fact, I'm going to share it now.
The webinar that I gave was sort of a precursor for this idea, but need 12 people signed up to officially start the SIG. And my intention is it will be an active SIG. We'll have Zoom meetings every, a couple of weeks or something like that to start the process. So if you're interested in what that design might be, the only way you're going to come up with a design is if you analyze the problem. Right? You got to know what the heck you're dealing with. And we've all got sentiments about things like capitalism and whatnot, but until we actually can break it down. Okay, good. There's one. So how's everybody doing?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Okay. You all saw my exchange with Lynn. So he threatened not to be here before I said, all right, I've had enough. You're just trying to hold us up captive to your terminology. And I honestly don't understand. I've had many conversations with the man about the venues that he has chosen to publish in. And, I go through all of these books that are on the same line as what Tyler and I started talking about way back when. He's not mentioned anywhere in those. There's nothing about the USSO or any of that kind of stuff. So it's not just me. I don't know.
George, I know him pretty well now after 20 years of knowing him. And I know that Jack Ring asked him to run some PhD seminars at UC San Diego for him, invited him.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he was invited to Caltech to do a series of PhD seminars, for dissertation people, students.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't do it. He was asked to do it. And I think there's something there. He's had amazing opportunities right in his neighborhood. And he kind of stuck with his undergraduate school with a master's program all those times. And if he had PhD students, he would have had a body of work.
Yeah.
Well,
We don't know.
It's brilliant work, and we will take it into account.
Exactly.
Len, if you're listening, we love you. We value your work. You need to get engaged. You're your own worst enemy.
I want you to know that I think that what we're dealing with here is an amazing genius, and I think we all recognize that. Way, way, way ahead of his time for very, very, very many years. Yeah. And yeah, it's. I don't blame him for not going to those seminars, for not doing those seminars, because he'd have to walk in there and justify 40 years of thinking that's completely different from what those people had in their very specific training.
Mm-hmm.
Well, George, would you like to take us through the analysis you've done in terms of the repulsors and the attractors on the ground sequence?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out. Listen, I would appreciate it if you would send a notification out for this meeting, because for some reason in my calendar, the link that I've got doesn't go there.
Okay.
Doesn't go here to this meeting.
Right. I'll do that now.
Let's see, futures.
Yes, I've got 2 links for this meeting in my calendar. I think I got another one for a different meeting, which I deleted. I got very, very confused.
Right. Okay, I'm going to send it.
But we're all on. We're all in right now.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm in the wrong.
Wait, George, you are here, right?
Yeah, well, Gary sent me this link.
I'm going to send it 1 hour before. Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be great.
That'd be great. Just
Because
I don't know why this calendar thing is so messed up. Now I
Yeah.
can't even find my folder.
Yeah, it did have a 30 minutes notification.
oh, I didn't get that. And the first thing I clicked on, it said we need the password for the meeting, and then I clicked on something else in the same calendar thing, and I just got on. So I was happy I got on, obviously.
Yes.
Oh, here it is. Jiminy Christmas.
That's
Okay,
interesting. So George, it seems I've actually accepted the meeting invitation, and it maybe you have to accept it before it gets into your calendar or something.
No, it's an ongoing meeting, and the link is there in the calendar.
Yeah.
Here it is. It's there in the calendar. It's just that it's to a wrong meeting, and I don't know how that got into the calendar. Okay.
I had 3 at one point and got rid of one of them without causing any catastrophes.
Well, I'm using Outlook in the calendar attached to Outlook, and it's just really. Helene, you want to say something?
Okay, it's fine, Helene. It's going to pop out for a
so-
little while, then come back.
I'll share the screen then.
Yeah.
Okay. So I sent this out to everybody and haven't gotten any comments. Tyler and I talked about it a little bit, but basically I said I wanted to go through his 12 levels and then look at the kinds of attraction and repulsion, which I claimed was all you need to explain the dynamics of how these things get together or push each other apart. And then I also found that I had to actually talk about the affordances in order to make this make any sense. So I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but basically the physical level, this is kind of interesting because the physical level down here, pardon me, we're basically just talking about the 4 fundamental forces of nature. So all of these affordances, basically the same being listed. And that, to me, that's kind of where Tyler was with his, why did I say 3 fundamental? 3 fundamental, well, anyway.
Well, it's 4 because you said, I think you're saying gravity is not crucial in these particular.
Oh, these guys, yeah. Well, it is for forming for nucleogenesis.
And they do have gravity. They do have mass. So
yeah.
Yeah, probably put it as all 4.
Okay. All right. Anyway, then when we get to molecules, things start to look a little more interesting because you have geometry starting to play a role. And how things get either express attraction or express repulsion depends on the geometric properties of the molecules involved. So in any case, I just, as you go up there are more and more options that I could have put in here, but I just selected a couple of them just to show that they do in fact play a role in this attraction repulsion kind of thing. I thought this was interesting. Mental models of this is the affordance in agro-villages. Breeding animals and plants and growth cycles and so forth. So this is what affords the ability to, just one of, probably 100 or more affordances. But in any case, the
George, a question about affordance. I do apologize. I said I would go through this in detail and make comments, but I realize it would be much more useful for us to do this as a group and a kind of a review process. And I did ask you something about affordances versus attraction and repulsion, whether attraction and repulsion were subsets of affordances. But so if I say the agro-village as an entity, when I think of the affordance of it, I would almost think of it as what's the affordance of the whole village as a system, as a thing, which the way I was thinking about it in my book was that one of the things the agro-village has is the ability to propagate itself and to move into places as a whole thing, because people are carrying their energy system along with them. They can control it to some extent, the crops and the animals, and bring them with them, not have to just be reliant on the wild resources of the hunter and gatherer community.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw that as so if affordance means what kind of relation does that whole thing have? And when walking through the steps, one might ask, what are the new relations that the agro-village has that the tribal meta group does not have, that is a hunter-gatherer group's networked?
Mm-hmm.
That the agro-village, one could probably say many things, but one thing was kind of seemed to stick out to me is that it can propagate itself, or it can plop itself down into areas at density, at where you could have groups of villages at densities where the hunter-gatherers wouldn't have. So the mental models, but then the mental models.
Let me explain something, Tyler. The affordances I'm listing here are affordances of the various components that make up the system that we're talking about. So these are what am I trying to say? These are the things that, say, animals, pheromones, that they are putting out.
So these are the internal interfaces.
Well, yeah. Right. What makes it possible for those to get together to produce this?
So they're the affordances of the level below that allow this level to come into existence.
But look at what you have for then multicellular organisms as the affordance, sensory systems.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a whole organism trait.
Oh, you're right. Okay. Maybe I got.
I wonder if George.
Oh, I know what I was trying to say. This is not actually sensory systems. We go back to eukaryotes, and they sense things like light and chemo and stuff like that through their membrane.
So
and
that's a whole system. That's a whole system affordance. Then again, I mean, is it possible you've mixed some affordances of whole systems and affordances of components in that?
Yeah. It looks that way.
Yeah, so
My gosh, I can feel some modelling coming up here.
yes.
Formal modelling too. I mean,
Yes.
it's a really, really good starting point.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is why we're doing this, group comments.
Yeah, I probably I maybe need another column
Add a
to
second
talk
column
about
in.
the affordances of prokaryotes that gave rise to eukaryotes.
Yeah, and there should be like a Z going down. Yeah.
Like a Z?
Like a Z.
D.
A Z in American speak.
What Gary's saying is that the whole system of affordances at one level become the component affordances of another level as new whole system affordances go in.
Yeah,
So maybe two columns to try to keep those things clear.
Right. Right. Yeah. I didn't even have this column originally. I was trying to go through this and picture in my mind, what kinds of things. And these are just singular examples for each one of these. And as I said, as you go down the list or up in the levels, things get much more complex. Once geometry comes into play, all those forces, it gets really complex.
Yeah. Lynn, I heard you trying to speak. Would you like to make
There's
that contribution?
There's something rolling around in my head about this, about George, about knowledge and structure at each level.
Oh yeah, that'd be lovely if we could identify the information and essentially the knowledge structure behind these systems. That would be great, because then you would have the information, the knowledge, the forces, and you could even add in the material substance. Yeah, and then we're starting to link into relational theory as well. You get what I mean, George?
I think so. You just a lot of work.
Hey, this is great. I love it.
Well, I don't know. I think you could maybe shake it down a little. It's in here.
Yeah.
These are examples of it, as Tyler was saying, more than it.
Yeah. What I'll do, George, is I'll add in some additional columns, and I'll put this onto Google Sheets. Yeah. And I'll distribute the Google Sheets link, and then we can all collaborate on this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. So at the end of this, send me the updated one if you've made any changes, and I'll.
The only change I made was that talking about 4 forces as opposed to 3.
Okay.
But it would be worth, I think, having some discussion about what we would mean by attraction and what we would mean by repulsion.
Yeah.
So in that notebook diagram I showed at the start, just before George came in, to show that I was thinking of this way myself, and I think this is a good way to think, because at all these levels, let's take prokaryotes. Not all bacteria merged and became eukaryotes. It was still okay to be a bacterium. So there must have been, let's say, reasons to continue as a molecule. By reason, I mean, I'm using the word very loosely, but reasons to continue as entities at various levels, and reasons to merge. So are we talking about attraction being the reasons? Are we talking about what made the previous levels things merge, and repulsion being what factors made them not merge, just kept them themselves? Is that what we're talking? Or just be clear,
well, that's what I'm thinking.
we're using the words attraction and repulsion a little bit metaphorically, but they're perfectly good as long as we define what we mean by these terms. What we're seeking it to put into the table.
Yeah, this was just a first pass, but that's exactly the way I've been thinking about it.
So it's attraction on any one row. The factors of the things on that row that would lead them toward merging, but not necessarily ensuring it, but lead them
right
toward.
That's why I call it affordance, because it affords that capability, but it doesn't by any means ensure it. There's also the issue of things, mixing and being driven by energy flows and stuff like that actually play into the actual combination or keeping things apart.
So I think what I asked you on the email, and I'm not sure of the answer, but I think I want to bring this up in front of everybody. If the repulsions, like for the prokaryote, the repulsion is orientation from noxious molecule gradients. So that's describing a behavior of a prokaryote to maintain its life, to go away from noxious things. But if the repulsion is also, oh man, it's really difficult conceptually. If the repulsion is just like the selfish gene idea, these organisms have to, it does not necessarily benefit them to merge and lose their autonomy. So in that sense, the repulsion, meaning to continue being a prokaryote, would include issues such as anything that makes its life continue. I don't know how to put this because it's a different concept of repulsion from just it's moving away from noxious chemicals. It's what is leading it to stay prokaryote and not become eukaryote. If the attraction is the thing that makes it become eukaryote. So I think there might be different kinds of repulsions and attractions in this, but but I'm wondering whether we need to distinguish those kinds before we try to make the list.
I think it's very important to do that categorization you were talking about before, the affordances of the level below that enable this level to happen versus the affordances of this level that might live at the next one. And the same goes for the attraction repulsion thing. Is it attraction repulsion between the systems at the level of interest or at the level below that generates it? So I think it just needs a it's very tedious and boring, but this is what Tom's been going on about. At the point when you start trying to get things rigorous, you need to spend a little bit of time really sorting out the definitions and the categories of those definitions, and you're amply rewarded later when everything gets easier.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to point out one thing though. So I just used Tyler's levels pretty much straight out, but I've been suggesting or insisting or something that I would like to see a little more refinement here through the origin of life problem as much as we can, because I think there's a lot of stuff hidden in here, namely the emergence of agency. So I would not say that molecules have what you normally use that word to describe, but prokaryotes, when they're orienting toward and moving toward, or orienting away and moving away, are expressing agency. And so something magical happens between this level and this level. We've already talked about the idea of a dissipative system, but there are non-living dissipative systems. So that's not a distinguishing characteristic by itself. So anyway, I just think that's a transition that we're going to have to somewhere along the line account for.
So at that level, I mean, I'm not a biologist. This is a question asked out of curiosity, not anything else. I would think of agency as meaning I've got choices and I choose between possibles rather than I'm simply responding according to a rule to a situation I find myself in. Is that kind of right? And well, does the cell do that, or does it just follow a more complex rule set?
The simpler the system, it's making decisions, right? I mean, I built robots that were trying to emulate natural brain decision processing, but they were still very simple. And so they were rule bound, but it's stochastic. It's not purely mechanistic / deterministic. And so as we go up these levels, we find that there's the degree of agency, the degree of ability to choose between options gets increased as you go.
Right.
This reminds me that I looked at something similar to this, but much simpler some time ago. I'll see if I can pull it out and send it up. But I was thinking in terms of properties, not affordances. And I remember there were several ways that they could combine. One, to create a new property through emergence. One, to accumulate, like mass would accumulate. And they could submerge, cancel each other out. For example, a positive and negative charge. And I envisioned that properties came from primitive particles, just inherent in primitive particles, or they came from systems. And I couldn't think of any other place they would come from. So if that's the case, then you could take a system at any level, say a living system, and you could trace down properties the whole way to primitive particles. There'd be a dependency tree of properties. Now, I've never run across that idea anywhere else. I don't know if it makes any sense or not.
In Mike and my book, the Principles book, we have a chapter on emergences. And we use the language of personalities rather than properties as such. So at any one of these levels, we can talk about it. I like the term affordance now because it suggests there is an action to be taken or can be taken, as opposed to just listing what might be thought of as static. You know, to me, properties sort of suggest a static set. But I was using terminology personality in the same way that I'm using affordances now. That you know, atoms have affordances in their valence electron shells. Molecules have affordances in the residual charge aspects after a molecule is formed. But now geometry comes into play in a much stronger way, and so on and so forth.
I'll tell you what I think off the top. What keeps coming into my mind here, looking at affordances, attraction, and repulsion, is I want to see those terms defined as systems processes clearly. I want to know the features and the functions of them, the features of what is an affordance. What is it? When I think in terms of systems processes instead of as principles or instead of personalities, but I actually see it as a systems process, then I can shake down the parts, their relationships. Do you know what I mean? I don't know.
Could you go a little bit more into that?
Well, I understand. I'm looking at affordances, and by looking at all the examples, we could go, oh yeah, okay, I get that. And then Tyler, you broke it down and went, wait a minute, some of these are affordances for the whole thing, and some are affordances for the parts. And then when we start talking about principles and we start talking about personalities, then I go, yes, that makes sense. But I want to know attraction. What is attraction? It seems like it's obvious. You know, we get attraction. That means things want to go toward each other, or things attract other things. Do things bond with other things? What do they actually do? Affordances. What is that? It has something to do with self-organizing systems, I think, with self-organization, with the forces that it has something to do maybe with the way things organize.
Yeah,
I
it's not-
want to know, if I know it more specifically,
Yeah.
or if I have a definition, then I can fill in the spaces.
Right, the definition of affordance I use, it comes from a book by a guy called Greg Norman, who something called the Design of Everyday Things. It was published in the early 90s, and he defines it as a potential for interaction. So,
Oh, interesting.
if you're designing a door, then you put the handle on it in a way that you should put the handle on it in a way that it's obvious what to do with it. Like if it's a handle, you lean forward and twist it. And if it's a flat plate, you push on the flat plate and you expect the door to open. So it's designing things to make it obvious what you should do with them. And you extend that to obviously the main affordance of an electron is it has electrical charge that allows repulsion and attraction. And a lot of the affordances of molecules, as George said, are to do with, that's the first point in the evolution at which you get geometry and asymmetry coming in, and that enables all sorts of extra dimensions of behavior, etc.
Yeah, it's somewhere in there. It's somewhere in the beginning of where you started with the door.
Yeah.
Is a actual definition. I want a definition. Now, I must have asked 3 or 4 times of Lynn, what about attraction and repulsion as systems processes? And he said they're counter parodies. And he threw all kinds of things into that box. And I wasn't happy because it didn't work for me. Didn't work for me, because I kept running into it. And so attraction and repulsion, a definition could be simple. We take it for granted, we take a lot of these things for granted,
Yes.
but when you start shaking it down when you start going off into tribal, when you start going off into human systems, it actually gets kind of important.
Wasn't Newton criticized for using gravity as sort of magic attraction? He couldn't explain how it worked. And aren't we still pretty much in the same position? We don't know what makes something positive and negative attract to each other. So it's sort of a property of a primitive particle. And don't we just have to sort of accept that, unless there's something in the system that actually causes it?
Right.
Now, what I think of these, the word attraction means essentially the potential to come together. Now, whether a bond forms or not, it's just the thing that's bringing these things together. Whether it is each of these things responding to an external force or responding to their own internal forces, as in the case of strong, weak, and electro forces. But it basically says these things, given the right environment that they're in, they'll be attracted to one another. Repulsion is just the opposite of that. That if they're close enough together, they're going to try to move apart. So it's a description of action rather than, and the affordance is the potential that they possess, in Tom's term, the properties that they possess that make those actions take place.
Yeah, I like the definition that Hilary used, because what that does is it essentially identifies the channel for whether that interaction is going to lead to a repulsion or an attraction.
Yeah. Well, if you look at my diagrams, both in the previous book and the new one, I show, a nondescript oval is the component, so to speak, and it's got little bars that come out are of different colors, and that's supposed to represent those potentials or affordances.
Mm.
So each one is a little bit different. And I think, Lynn, once you get up into living systems, we're starting to talk more and more about message transfers that activate things. So if one prokaryote has receptors and another prokaryote, or the same species, say for example, but another prokaryote has an ability to emit some chemical, and this one receives it, and then he can follow the gradient to, exchange DNA or something. I don't know. But as you go further along to more complicated living systems, you get into layers of information processing that have to be taken into account. Don't know if that helps, but that's kind of the way I'm thinking about this.
Is this, I like the definition of affordance as the potential for interaction, but I assume that it also includes the actual interactions it has. It's not just potential, unused potential. It would include.
No, it is actually potential whether used or not.
Whether used or not, okay.
Yeah, so in other words, the affordance is a property of the system or subsystem of interest.
So if we take something like agro-village, and we can say an agro-village can exchange, people can go across from one to another. Goods, trade, goods can go across. Tools, ideas can go across. And as I brought up, there's the potential for it to bud off and sort of replicate itself on the landscape. So I see all those as.
I'm not sure they're all affordances. Can I just give an example that I've thought through properly and therefore I'm comfortable with? Because that one I haven't. If you think about a complex computer network system, the vulnerabilities of that system to hacking are affordances. Whether or not it's hacked depends on the hacker as well as the vulnerable system. So the concept of a vulnerability of a system to some sort of attack or some sort of accident is an affordance. The action of exploiting that vulnerability in order to cause it to hack is an attack. So the attack is an interaction between two entities, the attacker and the defender, where the attacker is making use of the affordance. If nobody wants to attack the computer system, the fact that it has a vulnerability doesn't matter. So in that sense, the affordance is a property of the system that may or may not be activated. So I'm not quite sure how that fits with the agro-village, but I think a lot of the things you're talking, it's kind of distinct from a behavior. A behavior happens when the affordance or a property is activated. And a lot of what you're talking about, I would say, is behavior.
Wow. To me, those things get really entangled, though, because
they are.
Like if you have these villages and they're not isolated, some people can walk between them.
That's an affordance, the potential for people to walk in and out. So in other words, the affordance is defined with respect to the system without regard to external systems. Behaviors usually involve interactions with external systems. That's the way I would distinguish them. And an affordance enables a behavior, and a behavior uses an affordance in a loosely coupled system. In a tightly coupled system, you don't notice because you just design them to be interfaced permanently. So it's kind of, but yeah, I think if you think, is that there even if there's no interaction actually happening, then you've achieved the separation between a behavior and an affordance. And I think the things that you're talking about all involve affordances. I haven't thought them through sufficiently in terms of the exact words you're using to know whether they are all only affordances or things happening that make use of affordances. I find it quite difficult to work out how I would separate for an agro-village, how I would separate out the affordances from the behaviours, which is why I moved away to an example where you've got a much clearer defined system boundary, effectively. But yeah, in principle, yes.
If we're going to model these.
Yeah, you need to be, well, you need to think very, 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 it sounds really boring and really tedious and it's very techy, but this is how we make complex engineered systems work. And particularly when you're trying to apply a concept more generally than anybody has thought about it up to now, then these are the kind of things, there's a huge amount of value in working through. I mean, I suppose if you think of a walled city, sorry, I was just looking at meta patterns and saw these pictures of the huge cities. The gates in the wall are affordances to allow people to get in and out. The gate can be open or closed. The gate can be defended or not defended. So the affordances there, how it is configured and used and exploited and protected is something else. And I suppose, I mean, an agro-village, it must be the ultimate fuzzy boundary, because at what point does the grazing hinterland stop being part of the agro-village? And so it's a really good example, but it's also a really challenging one because of the fuzziness. Whereas a walled city has much clearer, if it's got wooden buildings inside the wall, that's an affordance that allows you to lob burning sort of fire bolts over the wall and set fire to the wooden buildings inside. The walls have ladders have steps on the inside, which are affordances that allow archers to get up to the top of the wall. The archers, when they stick their heads out, they provide a vulnerability to getting shot by enemy archers. Sorry, I'm not quite sure why I'm thinking of that one rather than something nice like a. Well, I suppose it's an old-fashioned form of civilization. But it's easier to visualize. And yeah, I think what that means is it's easier to visualize the less fuzzy the boundary is. And the reason I'm struggling a bit, I mean, I think most of these other things, you know, the language is the affordance that allows individual groups to communicate and form tribal metagroups. The mental models of breeding and growth cycles, I suppose, are affordances of bits society, really, in an agro-village that allows it to manage crops and things. So I'm quite interested in the geopolitical state one, but yes, I think it's quite complex. It may be another of these cases where it's better to start at the bottom and work up. So if we understand them, it's quite easy to define in terms of atomic and molecular levels, fairly easy, I think, to define in terms of cells, and then it gets, as the systems get more complex, it's more complex to think through.
Maybe a different approach to, you know, the troubling concept of boundary might be to consider what makes a particular village distinct. Yeah. What is its distinction? You know, I'm drawing on, you know, DSRP, for instance. You know, I suspect, I do. I mean, that's another thing that we could add into this. You know, and it comes back again to, you know, the concept of identity. What is the identity of the thing? What gives it its identity?
Oh, okay. So here's a question then. Suppose all the inhabitants of an agro-village up sticks and go and rebuild somewhere else. Is it the same agro-village, or is it the same community in a new agro-village?
Well, a key question there would be, how often did that actually happen? The fact that it could happen doesn't necessarily mean that it would happen.
Yeah. I mean, you could say that it's evolved into a tribal metagroup again, because it's it's lost its connection with the animals and the plants that were part of that agro-village.
There are a lot of examples of agro-villages and early brain states, what we start to call civilizations, that have been disrupted by climate change and other factors. And they dissolve, but they don't just simply, in the whole lot of them, move and rebuild everything they had before, that I'm aware of anyway.
The one example where that would be plausible, I think, would be flooding. If your valley flooded and you had, because of sea level rise or a glacier melting, and you moved elsewhere. It's a slightly artificial example, but I guess what I'm really saying is the agro-village, the community and its land, or is it the community and the structures it has built, or is it just the community? And since Tyler is the inventor of the concept of agro-villages, I guess that's a question for him. Because until you've answered that question, you don't know whether the affordances you're talking about are affordances of the agro-village system or of something else.
Yeah.
Well, here clearly I meant these as being the affordances of the components that make up the agro-village. And it's, again, it's just one example. I just wanted to go through and make sure, you know, I could sort these attractions and repulsions.
Sure. I mean, I think in my mind, the agro-village only comes into being when you've got a community and it has built permanent structures and it has kind of got a rough idea of what its boundaries are. So if it was in a valley, you'd kind of expect it to go up to the watershed in the valley.
Yeah.
That would be a concept I would be thoroughly comfortable with. And then the affordances are basically, you've got a pretty open boundary. You can grow stuff. Other grazing animals can come in and eat your crops. Oh, no, that's an interesting one. People can up and leave. If it gets overpopulated, as you say, you can send groups away. I can't work out if that's an affordance or something else. But the fundamental affordance is this quite open boundary that allows a lot of exchange across any boundary you might wish to define at any point as you radiate out. Sorry, just one thing and then I'll be quiet. The other thing that intrigues me about agro-villages is that's the level at which you start getting technology developing within the context of the agro-village.
Yeah.
And in the same way as once you get multicellular organisms, the organism provides a context in which organs can develop inside it. Agro-villages is the first level at which you get the context of significant technology evolving, and I'm not clear if that's happening inside the system or if it's whatever. So, and similarly, when you go to geopolitical states, you get another level of technology developing, which is essentially the bureaucracy and the weapon systems that allow you to control large areas.
So I got a book recommendation. Tyler, I don't know if I asked you if you'd read this.
I have read it. No, excuse me. That's not Against the Grain. Okay, yeah. It's
Against the Grain. It's a really good book describing the rise of, he calls them grain states. So from early agriculture up through these grain states, like in the, what am I trying to say?
Into the early city states or the early
exactly.
They're based upon grain being small particles that could also serve as currency. You could store it, rice, wheat, and that was a very interesting insight of that book. But to answer Hillary's question, Hillary, I would tend to include the technology inside the system. I mean, I would include anything that people are talking about within their language network. They might give their village a name. They can talk about the plants and animals that are inside it. They can have group decision making. They can train each other. They have buildings. I agree that the fuzziness of the boundary is an issue. It looks like we get some of the early stockades in these agro villages, but that's to protect the people or maybe the animals, not necessarily the crops.
Yeah.
So the crops would be included, and the people are trying to protect the crops, but it's not a divided piece of land. It's not a probably personal, you know, here's the border of our agro village. It's a fuzzy thing that goes out, but probably the people in their conversations have a sense of what's theirs and what somebody else better not come in and plant in their area. One thing I didn't fully work out is that at least to me, is the agro village is the tribal meta group with the plants and animals now brought into the system.
Yeah.
Where in the hunter-gatherer, they're talking about plants and animals. In a way, it's part of their linguistic system, but they don't have the same kind of control. It's external. They have to, it may be part of their mythological, symbolic systems, but they have to adapt to these plants and animals, the wild plants and animals that are outside in the greater forces of nature. And now with the agro village, that's the main ontogenesis or combogenesis event, is bringing plants and animals literally into the system of control. Yeah. And that's George's mental models of they now understand the breeding and growth cycles, and it's now internal. And this was a huge energy event, because they're bringing they're bringing, rather than the sun growing the plants and them going to get the wild plants, the sun is growing the plants inside the system. The sun's not really inside their system yet. They can't control that, or the weather or the rain, but they've brought the plants inside their system. So all that and what we can conceive of as their mental system is I would say is in the agro village, without us saying we need to say where is that boundary. I think they knew where the bound. They had a conceptual. They had a boundary. It was not necessarily a physical boundary all the time.
Yeah. So the only reason we need to think about where the boundary is to understand what the affordances are. Because like everything else in a quote system, they're measured at that boundary, and the fuzzier the boundary, the more difficult it is. So it's kind of a recursive problem, because as the system gets more complex, you've got more ambiguity about where you might find a boundary or choose to define a boundary. And if you want to be rigorous about what are affordances, then you've got to think through this, which is fine. And we don't need to solve it. I think it's useful to hear the debate just now. But
yeah, it's like you said, the affordance. So for example, some people who study the origin of agriculture say that the fact that people had to now store large amounts of food for the season that they're not harvesting in led to the possibility of raiding those stores of food, which would not have existed with the hunter-gatherers that are storing very little. But I guess it also led to the possibility of alliances with the stored food to have help go out to. I guess this worked in the American Southwest with the Hopi villages. Supposedly, the precipitation was so spotty that some villages just 10 kilometers away might have a good harvest and others might have a bad harvest, and they learned how to help each other. So I would say that in that way the affordances of what possibilities now came into existence that were not there before. Yeah. Even though you've still got human language that was there before, so that was not new, but there are new affordances that come in.
Yes.
So if I share my screen, share my screen. Okay. So you carry on the conversation.
Yeah, I was just going to say the capacity, the availability of something that is worth stealing is a really important affordance, because from that you can derive a lot of an awful lot of human history. Oh, you've got War and Peace. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what you were just talking about was, you know, the mutual protection of agro villages, which I guess would have formed the geopolitical, you know, first levels of geopolitical states. Yeah, because you know, by the benefit for the agro villages is hope and security. Yeah.
Yep.
And as a consequence of your pacts with your neighbours, you would have developed common laws and customs. Yeah. And that would eventually lead to command and control and war and peace with other geopolitical states.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
And right, and the people that do the theorizing about the growth of states say what happened is that when these laws and customs and hopes and security of the networks got complicated enough, got big enough, local sort of local security issues where people almost like one-on-one could keep each other in check could not handle it. So why did they grow big? Because there were advantages to being bigger, and new social systems came into existence to take advantage of those potentials to grow bigger. And not everybody did. Not every agro village did. Some didn't want to. I mean, there's what they call conflict of interest among levels. So because the villages then gave something up, and yet what they gave up, some of them now had to be taxed with grain, and then you had a ruling class that found it beneficial to continue the system even more so.
Yeah.
And this is, you know, in rough outline how some of the archaeologists are seeing that story as this sort of juxtaposition between, again, if we go back to the attraction and repulsion thing, there's attractions to going into the larger size, but there's disadvantages as well.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it?
To go back to the discussion about what are affordances and where's the boundary kind of thing and so forth. I got another book recommendation. Again, Tyler, I don't know. I think I recommended this, or you said
I cited that was it. Ian Hodder's book was fantastic.
It's a really good read, and it goes into a lot of that. But it points out, the way I would solve the boundary issue problem is to recognize that the subsystems of the system also themselves have boundaries. And you can get down to a point where you can say, oh, that's a fairly hard, non-porous boundary. And here are the affordances that face out into the rest of the system. So I think there's a way to do that, but it's going to be really complex.
Yeah.
I really, as far as boundaries are concerned, you really, with human systems, you really have to think in terms of networks and degrees of interaction.
Well, that's what this book
they're tighter within and looser without, because you can have all the walls of your city, you can have all that, but that's not what the boundaries are for the human interactions.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. They're tighter within and looser without.
We make these we make political boundaries, you know, like we know the city limits, but we very well know and that might have some limits for taxation. It might have some limits for certain things, but we know with human activity, we're driving all over the place. Hence the little COVID problem.
Tim Allen and Starr in their book Hierarchy had a couple different kinds of boundaries. One would be the structural boundaries, like we're talking about walls, and then Lynn, they were calling it functional boundaries. Boundary because of the tightness of the network between things serves as a kind of a boundary, but it's not a skin. It's a
right.
And I know George is familiar. Well, you're all familiar with these concepts.
Well, when you look at human boundaries, you can break it down into the usual economic, legal, social, you know, we have all kinds of boundaries, political. We have all kinds of boundaries we're making all the time.
Sorry, I didn't mean to start this one off, but I was just trying to make the point that, yes, if you want to identify the affordances of a complex system like an agro-village, then you have to do a bit of analysis of the system as well as understanding what affordances are. So sorry about that distraction. I was going to ask George, what was that book you were recommending? I didn't have time to see it.
It's called Entangled, an archaeology of the relationships between humans and things.
Oh,
it's by
interesting.
Ian Hodder, Hodder.
Right, cool.
It's really, I really second it. He's onto some cool stuff in there. And in fact, George, I recently looked him up just to see what kind of papers he's been publishing recently, and I've downloaded some stuff, and it's he's quite renowned. He's a Stanford University.
Yeah.
Gary, I guess Gary, when I look at these quadrants here, am I referring to Gary and Hillary, or is this mostly Gary? Or I know we don't really care too much, but Gary and Hillary. Okay. I got to memorize what your 4 are. I'm sorry, because every time I see it, I say this may be, with these diagrams, you've gone through them, you've already done it. Members get benefits, new types. Okay, good, thank you. New types of properties, new types of relationships. So I think I did have a question in my mind, your upper left and upper right, how distinct are they, or distinguishable are they? Members get benefits and members are constrained, meaning this is what I was saying, when they give up something, like
exactly.
So so I think the lower left and right, I'm pretty good with, and I think somehow George had to step away, but I think they somehow fit into this thing of what goes into the analysis of attraction and repulsion, because the benefits are sort of the attractions for the previous level to join, and the constraints are some of the repulsions of the previous levels independent things to join. But I'm still
right. A constraint is also a limitation on your degrees of freedom. So an electron joining an atom can no longer spin about the universe anywhere it wants to go to. Its benefit is it reduces the risk of it bumping into a stray positron and annihilating itself. The benefit for somebody going into an agro-village is that they get fed even on days when they can't work. And the constraint is they've got to follow the rules of the village.
But we could also say not just to say that the electron benefits by being safe from a positron annihilation, but it's got a lower energy level. So
there's a kind of for the electron level, there's a quantitative as well as a qualitative level of benefit. In fact, I guess for humans in civilization, the quantitative benefit is your life expectancy is much greater if you're in an organized civilization than if you're not.
So could I ask everybody, just like, are they okay with this, the lower level right and left as maybe concepts that would be worth that somehow relate? Because if people are okay with it, I'd like some discussion about the upper row.
Yeah.
Right. So let's think about atoms coming together to form a molecule. Let's just pick carbon dioxide as a topical example. So if you've got, as somebody, George, was saying, if you've got an individual atom that's rotationally symmetric, as soon as you stick 2 atoms together, they have a moment of inertia, they've got rotational and vibrational properties. So put 2 atoms together, they can vibrate back and forward like that. I don't know if you can see my hands. And it can also start spinning.
Stop sharing.
And the vibration and rotation. And these are the properties that mean that as CO2 gets warmer, it absorbs a lot more of the heat that's trying to get away from the Earth, because I examined this very thoroughly in my undergraduate degree and then played around with lasers, which depended rather critically on these properties. So the new properties of a molecule are rotation and vibration, are geometry, that mean it's got moment of inertia and it's got things. And the affordances for interaction are, it can, for example, they can transfer energy to each other in the spin and in the rotational and vibrational energy levels. They can also interact with photons, with relatively long wavelength photons, in a way that the individual atoms can't, because a photon trying to interact with an atom, it's got to excite an electron from one energy shell to the next one. Whereas to interact with the CO2 molecule, it only has to bump it slightly and it transfers momentum and energy to spinning or to vibration. So you've got extra, in the case of these molecules, you have much more complex optical spectra from a molecule than you can possibly get from an atom. So that's an example of new kinds of, I suppose, properties in terms of the emission spectra and affordances in terms of the potential for interacting in new ways with new kinds of things.
And that directly relates to a George's table with the affordance of the molecule being the fact that it can have multiple charges and three-dimensionality. It's not a spherically symmetric thing. So,
and water is the archetypal example of a polar molecule, because you've got two hydrogens and one oxygen, and I can't remember how it works, but you end up with more of the electric charges at one end of the molecule than the other. So that's why you get the polar attraction between water molecules. That means water behaves in a quite different way from almost any other fluid. We would not be here without it.
And I know you guys went through this all, and you were fairly confident in your ability to distinguish properties and affordances at all those levels, would you say?
At the levels we seriously considered, which were the levels we understood well, yes. So that's why I'm happy. I'm much happier to talk about this at the level of molecules and probably cells, because two reasons. We thought about them rather carefully, and they're relatively simple. So we're doing the classic reductionist bit, and what we're now trying to do is generalize back upwards. And you've thrown a very good challenge at us for saying go up several levels to still work, or how does it still work? I would be happy to go away and think about it, and see if I would be happy to try to go away and think about it. Yes, I'm very happy to go away and think about it. I can't promise to have any conclusions, but if I do, then I'll ping emails around and we can try and build on.
I mean, George, Tom, or Lynn, this issue of properties versus affordances of systems.
Yeah, what are you asking? Do we agree, or?
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was a very useful model to think about, and it does differentiate between, the new things that come into existence versus, well, put it another way. So in this model, properties are the new things that occur, so to speak, or are expressed, whereas the affordances are those that allow interaction to occur.
So with the
I hadn't thought about this notion of, for example, two gas molecules crashing into each other. They're transferring momentum, and maybe for some time excitation. I don't know, but there the property is also the same as the affordance.
Is affordance have to do with possibility space in some way?
Yeah. Well, on that word though, so I first ran into it in the realm of psychology. and it was actually in the context of robots, artificial intelligence. And,
Right.
and
I'm
the
listening.
the notion was, how is a robot going to recognize something that it needs to use, like a tool, for example? How does it do this? And for me, I was doing autonomous agents that were searching, they're foraging for resources and trying to avoid bad things. And so they had to be able to recognize when something was usable. But anyway, it comes from psychology, where it's the state of the observer, not necessarily the state of that which is being observed. And one of the examples that's used quite often is a hiker, on a hike, and he gets tired and sees a rock, convenient rock that he can or she can sit down on. So that rock afforded the ability to rest, but the actual decision to do the resting was in the brain of the hiker.
Yes.
Aha. So I think in my Quarks to Culture book, like I definitely don't separate those explicitly, but I know in my mind all those things were in it. So for example, with the prokaryotic cell, the fact that the cell, and we've talked about this before, the living cell needs to import and export just to maintain what it is as a system. So is a property, is a really new property that the bacterium as a prokaryotic cell has, that the molecules did not have.
Yeah.
So that would be a new property. But then what happened, because the cell can evolve and you can get different lineages of different metabolisms, the fact that it imports and exports gave rise to the possibility of somebody's export of a different lineage as a waste can be possibly a nutrient to a different lineage of prokaryotic cell after there's been evolutionary divergence. And that led to the possibility, well, many think the eukaryotic cell came about because the bacterium that was the mitochondrion and the archaean that became the host had some kind of complementary metabolism. So you get the possibility of complementary metabolisms coming from the new property of import and export, importing nutrients and exporting waste as inherent to the system of the prokaryotic cell. So it still has to be, yeah, Gary.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, one possibility that we could perhaps entertain is that when you look at a prokaryotic cell and its content, yeah, maybe the system that we're actually talking about is that lipid container, yeah. Maybe that container was the system, yeah, and then everything that developed within it was subsystems.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh no, the lipid contain. I mean, the whole thing. The whole. No.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that we have molecules, yeah, and then in this particular case, those molecules formed a new system, which was essentially the lipid bilayer, essentially empty cell. It's a vascule, I think, is the term, isn't it? Yeah. And then in that vascule, the subsystems arose, which increased the complexity of that very basic system. Yeah.
Well, I think you need to go back to Smith and Morowitz and the origin of life, because it's a lot more complicated.
Oh,
I think you're referring to.
Yeah. No,
I think you're referring to the coacervate theory that was back in the 1950s or whatever, because you can get lipids.
Yes.
And we're talking, in the case of a cell, we're talking about a bilipid.
Yeah.
That's manufactured.
Yeah.
Whereas,
But they do arise naturally as well.
huh?
They do arise naturally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the coacervates can form in the right pH and
Yeah.
whatnot,
It's just
but
a bubble.
and so that gave rise to people thinking, oh, maybe they came first, and then somehow or another got the, well, at least according to Morowitz and company, the process was probably a good deal more complicated and probably started with a proto-metabolism in the deep sea vents.
Which happened without the benefit of a lipid bilayer
Yeah.
surface.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
and
it might have been
Yeah.
in the crystalline structure of the rocks around the vent or something.
I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense because it kind of generalizes to what happens inside a cell can only happen because you've got a very high, you've got a very high entropy differential between inside and outside.
Yeah.
And the little bubble in the rock provides an environment in which that very high entropy difference can be sustained,
Yeah.
even without the lipid cell. And then presumably after a few billions of years, the boundary started to evolve somehow or other.
Yeah. No.
everybody. Go ahead, Gary. I'm totally interrupting you. It's very rude of me. Sorry.
No, Tyler. Sorry. It was.
We're here to listen to you, Tyler. It's all right.
Yeah. No.
So there's something there. There's something there with this property versus affordance that has to do with possibility. There's something. I'm now convinced there's something profound there that's worth trying to define conceptually to work on. And it also has to do with the attraction repulsion thing too. I mean, they're all, but oh man. Okay. But I told you I was been thinking about something recently. So let me just give an outline, and it relates to all this. I'm bothered by what George sent out, not what he sent out, but he sent out Lynn's, not Lynn, sorry, Lynn, not your list, Lynn's list, compared it to Harold Morowitz's list. And in fact, Len has two lists. He has this one list that has things like dark matter and dark energy, and then he's got this other thing with his ID cycles, his integration differentiation cycles, which George, remember I sent out this thing saying those are two different lists Len has going here.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and George and I were talking a little bit because Harold Morowitz has things like the origin of mammals, and Len doesn't have that at all. And so there's a subjectiveness to people's lists in terms of what people regard as important steps.
Well, I was thinking about that actually 2 o'clock this morning. And what I think got missed there was what he may be referring to is not mammals per se, but the emergence of the neocortex, which is also the pallium is the in birds, from reptiles to a new processing capability.
But one thing we've all agreed on in the past, that it might be useful to distinguish levels that form from combinations of prior existing things that were stable, and levels that form within as a kind of a complexification within a thing.
Yeah.
And I think in the last meeting, Len even said he agreed. He mixed those levels, where he's got multicellularity, and then later he's got the nervous system, in which he's trying to say nerves gather together. But Len's not going to be continuing in this, in being subjected to the online peer review process, because I don't see it as nerves. It wasn't like all bunch of nerves suddenly gathered themselves together. It's that nervous systems that grew into brains. It was an evolutionary thing within the multicellularity as something that was adaptively advantageous. So it's not really an integration in the same way that cells integrated into multicellular. And I'm sorry that Len's not going to continue this, but I started thinking this issue of ontogenesis of new things versus new stuff forming within things, because that's our social stuff too, Lynn, right? I mean, the social complexification is happening within social structures. So you can have a nation state, like the United States when it first forms is a certain thing, and it's still the United States, but it's gotten a lot bigger and a lot more levels within it. And so so somehow I think that distinction, which Tom was then suggesting various terms for, should come into this picture as well. So here's what I was thinking. Is there a way, if we can say that there are these steps of like say the 12 of the grand sequence, but I do agree that going from, I just want to say publicly, from molecule to living cell has intermediate steps, and we have to think about how to define what a macromolecule has that is different from what a molecule has. So I still need to see that, but I agree it's there. But if we can say like a combogenesis logic can allow us to derive a sequence that we can agree on that is as objective as possible, because what we did, we tried to apply a logic. It wasn't a person trying to say, I think this is important, and some other person says, I think this is important. Then can we build out from that in the following way? The following three, here's my suggestion for three build-ups. One would be within the things, there can be differentiation within the things. There can be a differentiation of new types of that thing. So this would be distinguishing of a living system, complexification of its internal components and their relations, versus the species or the kinds of, Len's got this, the kinds of nation states or the kinds of things of that, the kind, it's a different kind of complexification. And then the third one would be when these things come into existence of these new levels, they interact with the larger stuff, cosmos, the biosphere, the noosphere, whatever you want to call it, and they are participating in new kinds of systems, ecosystems in biology. Or here's stars come in, you can't have stars until you have protons of matter, atoms that are going to gravitationally attract into stars to start the fusion reaction. So in that way, we can bring in things like stars and ecosystems that we want to bring in by asking what of these 12 foundational levels was brought in new. So I said I didn't have this written out in a way I was totally coherent about, but I saw these three different diversification, through these three diversifications. One is internal, one is new kinds of that thing, and the third one is it's now part of these macro networks.
I want to add some stuff. Somewhere in there, I'd put in scale, a change in scale among hierarchical levels. There's, when your work, Tyler, is about energy usage a lot, and you get into the changes of energy, how it's used, stored, used differently, transferred differently among the different levels. And I've been just completely tripping out, George, on information, knowledge, energy, structure, material, your thing, your chart.
Yeah.
Just like, thanks a lot. Had to rewrite everything. Okay, so thanks a lot.
He does look smug.
Yeah. So, but I'm thinking as we look at these different levels, we're looking at, and I thought of mammals, it's not just the frontal lobe, it's their use of, our use of energy, of being able to adjust our temperature within as opposed to without, that amphibians don't have. We're warm animals as opposed to cold animals. We maintain 98.6 or whatever we maintain.
So are birds the same or not?
Well, see, birds. Well, the distinctions. I don't want to get into all the distinctions right now, but the use of, I think, distinctions could be made in, yes, levels of complexity.
But sorry,
birds are energy. Use of and scale.
Yeah, so, sorry, I had a very specific point I was probably trying to make there, too elliptically. You picked on mammals. Last time I picked the same example. Mammals is an example of something that does something nothing else does. And then I thought, no, birds do that as well. And then I had to go back 300 million years before I found common ancestors. So there is something between the amphibian and the root of birds, dinosaurs, mammals, and I don't know what else. So none of these mammals or different things actually survive detailed analysis the way you expect it to when you start.
And that makes me go back to the trap of thinking in terms of ladders of things instead of networks of things developing.
Well,
we have to be really careful with this ladder thing that we see hierarchies.
Sorry. The reason I'm sold in Tyler's classification is it's the only one I've seen that meets his criteria. However, of course, it's the only one that meets his absolute objective criteria. There is no ambiguity. You apply a simple rule set, and immediately the distinctions pop out.
And what I'm suggesting is that since it does not include stars or ecosystems or all kinds of important things, that maybe, and this is maybe in George's diagrams already, that but maybe not distinguished, that if we have a logically distinguished levels but it does not have a lot of other stuff that we would like in there, could we use that as a core to connect, to bring in these other things? Stars, ecosystems, community, transnational agreements for a global scale. I don't know, Lynn, what other, Hillary, what other ones do we want to bring in here? Hearts, brains, organelles, NGOs internal to countries, things internal, things. Okay, enough of me getting excited here.
Well, there's a slide that Gary flipped up for about 2 seconds about 10 minutes ago, which was my attempt about a year and a half ago to set that question out. It doesn't give answers, but I was starting to try to understand how these different things fitted together. The first thing I got hung up on is how do you get from atoms to crystals as well as molecules, but it was the beginning of that. It's slightly ill, but you see, you've got. I think I have a much more complex version of that somewhere. It doesn't matter, but yes, the minerals and crystals as well as the organic molecules and viruses and cells and things. So. That's not right, but it was the beginning of trying to map out that structure and see what started to happen. And the complex ecosystem things come because of this sort of Z effect as the components of the ecosystem become more complex, and the ecosystem tends to become more complex as well, which is probably about network or stuff. But it's all about having this absolute, it doesn't matter how few steps there are and how big the gaps. You've got this absolute complete qualitative jump, and then you've got a huge amount of complexification and detailed branching and stuff going on. And then there's another disruptive jump that creates another level above, still containing all the ones that have gone before. But you've got this, you get stars, you get, I didn't even know where to put them, stars and galaxies, and then you get planets coming out of them. That creates the context in which crystals and rocks can start to form, which creates the context in which organic systems can start to evolve, which creates the notion of a kind of semi-stable ecosystem that can then start modifying the climate of the planet. And that creates the stability in which animal social groups and all that lot can develop, and then they create the context in which technology can develop. Yeah. And I had this sort of picture, which this at the time was my best attempt at explaining it. And it's just been sitting there until it seems we have to start coming at the idea and explaining it in lots of different ways before the original attempt makes sense, which is fine, which is why we're doing this. But yeah, that was my primitive effort, and I'd really love to. I can't get it much further myself, but I think if other folk are starting to see some pattern like that emerging, then
I think we should try something. I mean, George has this in those diagrams in his book I sent out to everybody. It just excerpted the ones that interested me, that formed the sequence where and it's related to this. You're networking out, George. You know, you had stars, you had planets, as well as you had this main sequence of kind of the buildup, the nested, the core. Like there's a core sequence of a nested buildup. But every time a new level comes into being, it affects the macro. And there's these, what Hilary's saying, these macro contexts that then come in and are necessary for that core nested buildup to happen. And I guess in a way, George is what I would see, and Hilary, I know there was another diagram of sort of a network kind of diagram, I think. But I guess, George, you had these lines going off, but every line was the same. You were just showing connections there. But maybe what we need to do is think of these lines as being different categories of lines. You know, either property lines or affordance lines or something like that. Oh, that's George's, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that these, I mean, I'm guessing that these lines, there's really differences in what these lines are.
Well,
it's not to critique it. It's not to
that's right.
criticism. I guess it is to critique, but not criticize.
Okay. What was going through my mind is that these represent major relations in terms of coevolution. That you couldn't have rocky bodies sort of co-evolving at the same time of galaxies and whatnot without the molecular and crystalline entity.
Okay.
So it did. I wasn't trying to say anything's causal. You used arrows.
Or just to distinguish properties from affordances or
right. This is just to tie to get. Well, this is actually what got me so excited about your book, is I had gone through this exercise and said, oh boy, here's the this that, and a lot of this was based on Morowitz, right? So it was just an attempt to show that the universe is getting more complex over time. And it takes it all the way up. There are 3 slides there. Yeah. It takes it all the way up to nation states.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, what I think has been really good today is that, I mean, we've done this in the past where Tom has sent something out, or Hillary, last time you sent something out. We're sort of using this group as a way to review ideas if somebody has written something explicitly. I mean, Hillary, right? That last time that happened with what you sent out. This time George sent out the table of attraction and repulsion. We were able to at least start with that. I just want to express, I think that's been working, really well, without us trying to set too explicit a goal yet. So I think it's been a good thing.
Yeah, it's,
Yeah,
I think it's working.
I found the diagram that I mentioned before. If I can display it,
Sure, go ahead, Tom.
it's very simple. Okay, how do I do it?
You need to
Uh,
share screen with a little icon at the bottom.
Share screen.
Green at the bottom. If it clicks on it, you should give you a choice of something you can click on that you want to share.
I will go to the kitchen and mute so I can carry on listening while starting to organise dinner.
Yeah.
What's for dinner tonight, Hillary?
It's a 3-hour cooked lamb casserole, so it should be absolute melt in the mouth.
Oh, Hillary.
You mean it's already been cooking for 3 hours? Oh,
Been cooking for 2.5, yeah.
Right. I think we should let Tom show the diagram and have a short discussion, but then we're really going to have to close because
I agree. I agree.
I'm having trouble sharing here. I've got selections. I've selected one, and I hit the share button. Nothing seems to be happening.
Right. Do you have multi-screens?
Uh,
Have you got several screens?
yeah, I have several screens up.
So try another one, because sometimes it's an odd thing. My students, when I was teaching online, saying you're going through the PowerPoint, but we're not. You know,
Yeah.
there'd be several PowerPoints up there.
We had this problem, and your host, it said your host did not allow screen sharing. Remember that?
Yeah, I've turned that off, so it should be okay now.
Yeah, because I did share a screen. Mm-hmm.
Can you see that now?
No. What I can't do is share your screen for you, Tom.
All right. Well, I'll send it out. It's just one slide.
Okay.
Okay.
Talk later.
You sending it by email, yeah?
Gary, you sent out a chat. Could you take a look at these slides again during the time between our next meeting?
Yeah. So
what are those slides exactly?
yeah. So all of the stuff I've been flashing up, it's all on that Google Slides link. Yeah. So,
some of the stuff you showed today, because but you've been touching it up as well. You said. Okay, Tom's on.
I've made a couple of changes, but nothing drastic. It's basically all of the stuff that you've been sharing that was in slide format. I've been trying to integrate. Okay, go ahead, Tom. We can see it now.
You can see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me make it bigger.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so I did a system type model, which is what's on the left, only up to water, from molecular group level. Then I wanted to show the types could be put in levels based on relationships. And I thought about the properties and how they were related going across the levels. Of course, mass is elemental to quarks, and then it accumulates at every level above that. There's an electromagnetic charge that's elemental, and it accumulates, and then it submerges mostly, but some of it still exists. I think there's a better term for that than reappears.
Yeah, but I know what you mean. It's a good concept. Yep, it reappears in the atomic bonding. Yeah.
Right. And the chemical properties emerge at the atomic level. The color charge is elemental to quarks, and it submerges at the hadron level. So this is just the bottom end, and it's very simple, but it seems like it's something that's worth going further with.
Yeah.
And I think the affordances and the properties are similar. I like the term affordance as well, but.
So with this, I'll just raise this again, and Hillary, I know, is totally on board with this. Gary too, but is that when you get to a living cell, and now you get a property of requiring import export, is how, Tom, would you deal with that? A new column that appears that it did not exist for anything below it?
Yeah, that would be a challenge. But of course, it could be much more. It's certainly at least a remarks column where you can describe things more completely.
Yeah, because I mean, Hillary had the suggestion once, and that we should try to ideally give an example in the physical chemical, an example in the biological, and an example in the cultural, to sort of force us to I mean, I can see this and it looks really good. So I was just wondering, maybe it's just adding a column that suddenly with life, it's going to have mass.
I'll see what I can do with it. The idea that really excites me is that there's only two places that properties come from. Either they're elemental to the particles, or they're created through a system. And is there any other place that a property can come from? If there isn't, then at any level, we should be able to take the properties and have a dependency tree down to elemental particles.
Oh man, I don't know, because if we solve the origin of life thing, but definitely when you get to these proto cells that George talks about, where you get molecular systems that themselves require input and output because they're building themselves through substrates. To me, that is something so new. It's almost, because it then leads to an evolutionary system that almost seems elemental at that level, but it's not elemental in terms of the standard model of particle physics. Or like when you get human language come in, complex language, that would be elemental. Now, how did language come into being? We don't know. There'd be some gradation, but we're not going to figure that out. And Lynn has trouble with properties. Yeah, okay, yep, okay. With the property discussion, with the properties and principles on the processes. So Lynn, where does it's really important that a living cell imports nutrients and exports waste. That's something. So how does that fit into what you're searching for? I mean, it is a process in a sense. Lynn, I mean, how does that fact?
Sorry, I have to unmute.
Yes.
Okay, we're looking at, if we say instead of properties and principles and all of that, we go, okay, what are the processes at systems levels? Then we start defining, okay, how do things actually, what is this process? You're asking a different question. It frames the response differently. I go, okay, so the inputs and the outputs of that change that happens with at the cellular level that you're talking about, is the process of we're looking at energy transfer processes, that change, which was a process of, obviously we're talking about combogenesis, ontogenesis, whatever we're going to call that. All these things. So what processes changed within the cell that didn't exist before, or that existed in less complexity before?
I probably can convolute those terms a little bit, because I'll say a property of the living cell is that it has import and export processes. But I know that's not what you're looking for.
Well, I just say the whole thing. It's just a worldview that I have from 20 years of working with Lynn. And I'm telling you, it means, okay, so Gary just wrote property, an attribute, quality, or characteristic or something. What if everything is a process? What if everything is process? Everything.
Well,
Everything's a system.
So yeah,
exactly.
Can I butt in here for a moment? Lynn, have you looked at the universal? The formal basic ontology, which has got a very good object process set of views separated out. The way the way us boring, thick engineers think about it is you've got product, you've
I've
got
been through that.
structure and you've got function and all that. In my experience, is that works. Certainly, the way Tom's laid things out, the thing that struck me about the same time as you started talking about energy exchange was at a atomic and molecular level. That starts happening at interactions between the molecule or atom and photons. So you've got affordances that allow that sort of thing coming in there, and then you've got much. But yeah, it's all down to what are the affordances that allow energy exchange. I think it is more useful in the same way as when we were looking at the realist constructivist debate. It's more useful to find the good things about both viewpoints and just say there's a religious divide between processists and objectivists.
Well, I think that
neither view is complete.
Yeah, I've already sat through the NCOSI view of the engineer's view of the world many times, and about
Lucky
structure.
you.
I mean, this is not new news. I don't want to go into that world. That's why I put it in chat.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, I'm a very practical person. I'm not talking.
Oh, you're an engineer.
I'm actually. I have to say, engineering is constantly dealing with the problems of processes. The fact that things are not structures. They're not structures. They're not processes. They're constantly changing, constantly moving, just at different scales.
Yeah,
but Lynn, you have one of your processes being hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right.
Hierarchy.
But to me, that sounds like a property. That sounds like a property.
No, that if I could change the language, this is the problem we have. And I have that in my introduction. The problem I have is we have bonds, we have hierarchy, and we see those as structures, but actually we're hierarchying. Now, networks, it's very interesting. It's in the lexicon as networking. We're networking now because we understand how networks work.
Right.
We're networking.
Right.
And we didn't network. I'll tell you, 20 years ago when I took my first systems class, networking wasn't there. Network was not hardly there.
So are you the philosopher Alan Watts? You probably.
Yeah, of course I know Alan Watts.
Yeah,
I live in Hawaii. For God's sake.
So he used to say a tree is not a tree, it's treeing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's very Buddhist. And I want you to know I live in the middle of East-West land right here. And nothing is solid in my world. Nothing. So I can't even, I really am, I understand that I'm operating within constraints of language that apparently the Chinese don't have.
So we're static oriented, and the world is actually
very much so. It's in our language, but the actually Mandarin is not. It's not structured like that.
Okay. I'll give him.
Anyway, I don't want to go there.
We're keeping Hillary from Islam.
Right. So, final thoughts. So I'm going to take George's Excel, make it available on Google Sheets, and then share it amongst the group so that we can actually start to work on it collaboratively. On all of these things we've been talking about. I think the session today has surprised me again, just how fruitful the conversation has been and the discussions. It's been absolutely magic, and I'll once again say this onto YouTube so that we can all see it. So final thoughts, everybody. Let's go with Tyler first.
Oh, carry on. Rejoice, rejoice. We have no choice. As Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young sang.
George?
I don't really have anything to add at this point, other than I need another cup of coffee.
Yeah. Tom?
Again, I think this is very good and it's well worth doing, but I would like to get things down into a model.
Yes.
I haven't given up on the very simple, the various 2 or 3 types of genesis. And I'm going to update that model. I got some feedback
Yeah.
on it. Hopefully we can come to a conclusion for just a working version of it. It doesn't have to be forever. We can change it whenever we want, but at least we'll have something that's well defined that we can refer to.
Yeah, but I think the spreadsheet will help with that. Lynn?
I've said enough.
You said sufficient. Yeah.
Okay, as long as you're happy.
Yeah. Hillary?
I'd just say that if we consciously open the vocabulary up to, I keep harking back to the basic formal ontology, that it was a novelty for me. That's got room for everything that Lynn wants to put in.
Can you share that?
And the bit. Oh yeah, I'll send a link to the book.
Just send a link to it.
I ended up buying the book on Kindle, but the book that I've got is the only thing I've ever read about ontology that made any sense to me, so it's quite useful.
Okay.
But there's a couple of graphics in it that actually say it all. The only other thing I wanted to say is I can't get it because I'm on a tablet. I can't save the chat. So if you wouldn't mind saving the chat and sending it around to give us that link, or just send around the link you wanted us to.
I will do. I will do. So
no, it's been very good.
Great. Okay, right. You can go and have your lamb now. I'm going to go for a bike ride and do some physical activities. I've been sitting down far too much for this week. Right. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Thank
bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.